In 1889, a railroad surveyor named Robert Brewster Stanton watched 3 men drown in the Colorado River in the space of a single week. He buried what he could, wrote what he had to, and then he went back down into the canyon anyway. And somewhere along the red wall of Marble Canyon, about 140 feet above the water, he climbed up into a hole in the limestone that had been sitting there, dry and dark and patient, for thousands of years. What he found inside was strange. What came out of that cave over the following century was stranger. Driftwood carried in by a river that has not reached that height in living memory. The bones of animals that went extinct before the first pyramid was cut. Hundreds of small figures of deer and bighorn sheep, each one twisted from a single split willow twig by hands that left no name, no village, no grave. And then, at a certain point in the 20th century, the United States government welded a steel gate across the mouth of that cave and locked it. The official reason takes 9 words. The unofficial reasons have taken 30 years and counting, because the question people keep asking online is not really what is inside Stanton's cave. It is why a hole in a cliff, in a canyon that already takes 2 days by boat to reach, needed a lock on it at all. Let's go find out. To understand the cave, you have to understand the man, and to understand the man, you have to understand what he was actually doing down there. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Because Robert Brewster Stanton was not an archaeologist. He was not a treasure hunter. He was not even, in the way we tend to imagine 19th century canyon men, an adventurer. He was an engineer, and he was in the Grand Canyon to build a railroad through it. That sentence tends to stop people, so sit with it for a second. In the late 1880s, a group of investors led by a Denver businessman named Frank Mason Brown looked at the Colorado River and did not see a wonder of the world. They saw a grade. A natural, continuous, gently descending grade, running roughly 1,000 miles from the coal fields of Colorado down toward the Pacific coast of California. Railroads hate mountains. Railroads love rivers because rivers have already done the expensive work of finding the flattest possible line through impossible country. Brown's plan was the Denver, Colorado Canyon, and Pacific Railroad. The idea was to lay track along the water's edge, straight through Marble Canyon, straight through the Grand Canyon, and out the other side. Coal in, coal out, and a fortune for whoever owned the right-of-way. Stanton was hired as chief engineer. And in the spring of 1889, the survey party pushed off into the river in boats that anyone who has spent 5 minutes on whitewater would look at and immediately understand as a death sentence. Thin cedar hulls. No watertight compartments. And, in one of those decisions that history keeps around specifically to be cruel about, almost no life preservers, because Frank Brown had decided they would add too much weight and cost. On the 10th of July, 1889, at a rapid now called Salt Water Wash, Frank Brown's boat flipped. He came up once. He went under. He did not come up again. His body was never recovered. 5 days later, at a spot the survivors named 25 Mile Rapid, 2 more men went into the river, Peter Hansborough and Henry Richards. Both drowned, both gone. 3 men dead in 6 days, and the president of the company was one of them. Any reasonable person quits here. Stanton hiked out, went to Denver, raised more money, redesigned the boats in steel, hired new men, and that December he came back and started the whole thing over. That is the personality you are dealing with. Hold on to it, because it matters at the cave. On the second expedition, in the winter of 1889, going into 1890, the party was moving through Marble Canyon when they spotted an opening in the wall. It sat high above the river in a formation called Redwall Limestone, which is the pale grey rock that turns red in the Grand Canyon only because iron washes down from the layers above it and stains its face like makeup. They climbed up, and what they walked into was not a crack or a shelter. It was a real cave, running back into the cliff for something like 150 feet, with a floor of soft, dry, undisturbed dust. The dryness is the whole point. Almost everything that has ever been made by human hands is in a slow race against water and rot, and in a place like Marble Canyon, where the air pulls the moisture out of everything, that race stops. Things do not decay. They just wait. So the survey party did what a survey party does. They noted it. They looked around. Stanton would later write about the cave, and his name is the one that stuck to it. And then they got back in the boats, because they had a railroad to survey, and a river that had already killed 3 of their friends. Stanton finished the survey. He proved on paper that the railroad was possible. It was never built. And I want you to sit with that too, because this is the part that the strange corners of the internet have latched onto, and to be fair to them, it is a genuinely odd fact. A full engineering survey exists. A financially serious group of men died in the attempt. The route was mapped, the grades were calculated, and then the entire plan simply evaporated. And within a few decades, the same corridor was on its way to becoming a national park, where the idea of a coal train running through it would be treated as blasphemy. That is the raw material. Now let's talk about what the cave gave up. For decades, Stanton's cave was essentially a rumor with a name on it. River runners knew it existed. Some of them climbed up. Some of them took things. Nobody wrote much down. Then, in the winter of 1933 into 1934, an expedition led by the naturalist Frank Dodge and a young geologist named Ian Campbell went into the canyon, and their party visited the cave. And this is where the story you have probably heard actually begins, because someone came out of Stanton's cave that season holding something that made no sense. Small figures, 4 to 6 inches long, most of them, each one made from a single willow or cottonwood twig that had been split lengthwise down most of its span and then folded and wound back on itself, over and over, with a precision that is genuinely difficult to reproduce, even when you know how it was done. The results are unmistakably animals: deer, bighorn sheep, 4 legs, a body, a head, sometimes horns. They are called split-twig figurines, and there are hundreds of them. They were not lying scattered on the floor. Many were found placed deliberately, some under small cairns of stone, arranged in the darkness far back from the entrance, in a part of the cave where no one was living, no one was sheltering, and no one was cooking. A few of them have been found with what appear to be tiny spears or twigs pushed through the body. The dating came later, once carbon-14 existed to do it. The figurines from the Grand Canyon caves come back at roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years old, which means that when they were made, the Egyptian pyramids were already ancient. Stonehenge was already standing, and someone was climbing 140 feet up a sheer limestone wall in a canyon in what is now Arizona, in the dark, carrying a small folded willow deer to leave it in a place where it would not be seen again for 4,000 years. There is one more thing about the figurines that almost nobody mentions, and it is the detail that has stayed with me longest. They are not all the same. Researchers who have handled enough of them can see individual hands in the work. Some are tight and controlled, some are loose. Some show a technique that appears in one cave and not in another, which means this was not one person doing one thing once. It was a practice. It was taught and passed down and refined across generations by people moving through a canyon that offers you almost nothing. Nobody knows why. That is not me being dramatic. That is the actual state of the scholarship. The best guess, and it is offered as a guess, is hunting magic, some ritual of sympathy or petition performed before a hunt by people of what archaeologists call the archaic period. But it is a guess, built almost entirely on the objects themselves, because the people who made them left almost nothing else. No permanent settlement, no pottery, no burial ground. Just the figures, in the dark, under the stones. And then it gets stranger, because the figurines are not the oldest thing in the cave. Underneath and around them, researchers found bones, and the bones did not belong to anything that walks the canyon today. There were remains of Harrington's mountain goat, an animal that went extinct roughly 11,000 years ago at the tail end of the last ice age, and which is known from almost nowhere on Earth except a handful of Grand Canyon caves. There were the bones and, remarkably, the feathers and eggshell of California condors, from a time when condors nested in these cliffs in numbers we have no modern parallel for. There was dung. There were the remains of extinct species of birds. And in some layers there was material associated with mammoth and other Pleistocene megafauna. Stanton's cave is not one site. It is a stack of them. It is a vertical archive, laid down over tens of thousands of years, and preserved by nothing more sophisticated than the fact that the air in there is dry, and nothing has ever bothered it. Which brings us to the driftwood. Deep inside the cave, well back from the entrance and well above the modern river, there is wood, not firewood, not tools, driftwood. Water-worn logs and branches, carried, deposited, and left. Think about what that requires. That wood is sitting roughly 140 feet above the surface of the Colorado River. For the river to have put it there, the river would have to have been 140 feet higher than it is now. Not in flood for an afternoon. High enough, long enough, to float timber into the back of a cave in a cliff. The estimates for when that happened run into the tens of thousands of years, and the mainstream explanation is the one you would expect. Over that kind of timescale, canyons change. Rockfalls and lava flows and landslides have repeatedly dammed the Colorado, backing it up into enormous temporary lakes that later burst or eroded away. There is good geological evidence for exactly this. The river we see is not the river that was, so that is the official picture. A cave that has been quietly recording the last 40,000 years or so of one of the most dramatic landscapes on the planet, and doing it with perfect fidelity because nothing has come along to smudge the page. And now I want to tell you why anybody was down there in 1934 in the first place. Because this is the part that never makes it into the videos, and it is the part that makes the whole picture snap into focus. They were not looking for figurines. They were looking for dam sites. In 1922, the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin signed an agreement dividing the river's water between them. It is called the Colorado River Compact, and it is arguably the single most consequential document in the history of the American West, because it turned a river into a ledger. From that moment, every drop of the Colorado was assigned to somebody, on paper, whether or not the drop actually existed. And the only way to make a ledger like that work is to build the machinery to hold water back and let it out on a schedule. So the surveying began. In 1923, the United States Geological Survey ran a full expedition through the Grand Canyon, led by Claude Birdseye, mapping the river foot by foot, and the explicit purpose was to identify where you could put concrete. They looked at every narrow spot in that gorge and asked one question, which was, could we plug this? Boulder Dam, which we now call Hoover, went up between 1931 and 1936, and it is the reason the phrase, the Colorado River, no longer means what it meant to Stanton. It means a plumbing system. And in the winter of 1933 into 1934, in the middle of all of that, another river party went down through Marble Canyon, and among the men on it were people whose actual job was the water and the rock. Frank Dodge was a boatman for the government surveys. This was, in the truest sense, a working trip. The cave was not the mission. The cave was something they walked into while doing a job that was about hydroelectric power and irrigation contracts and the legal claims of California against Arizona. So the objects came out of Stanton's cave, and the reason there was anybody there to bring them out was a fight over water rights. Which means that from the very beginning, from Stanton's railroad in 1889 to the dam surveyors in 1934, every single person who ever climbed into that cave was there because somebody was trying to make money out of the Colorado River. The archaeology is a byproduct. The archaeology has always been a byproduct. Nobody funded a trip to Marble Canyon to look for 4,000-year-old willow deer. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. They funded a trip to move coal, or to store water, and the deer were simply lying there when they arrived. Hold that thought, because it is going to come back. Now let's talk about the gate. At some point, the National Park Service closed Stanton's cave. A steel grate went across the mouth. It is still there. You can float past it on a commercial river trip today, look up, and see the bars in the cliff face. And the reason people find this so provocative is not really the gate itself. It is the way the gate collides with everything I just told you. Here is a cave that contains the physical evidence of a river that once ran 140 feet higher. It contains a species of goat that is not supposed to exist. It contains hundreds of ritual objects made by a people who left nothing else behind, placed under cairns in the dark for reasons nobody can explain. It sits in a canyon that a railroad company mapped, paid for in blood, and then abandoned without ever laying a rail. And it has a lock on it. If you spend any time at all in the revisionist history spaces online, in the world of what gets called the Tartaria hypothesis, the mud flood theory, the reset narrative, you already know exactly what happens to a fact pattern like that. It gets absorbed. It gets welded into a much larger claim, which runs roughly like this. The claim is that the timeline we are taught is wrong, not by a little, but by an enormous and deliberate margin. That there was a prior civilization, technologically capable, globally distributed, whose infrastructure we have inherited and misattributed. That some kind of cataclysm, usually described as a flood or a mud event, buried it. That the survivors, or more precisely the institutions that emerged after, rewrote what happened, salvaged the buildings, claimed the ruins as their own construction, and produced the official history we now take as settled. And that the evidence of the older world is not hidden in some remote vault. It is sitting in plain sight, in the ground, in the walls, in the caves, and the only reason we do not all see it is that the doors have been closed and the people who kept the keys wrote the textbooks. To that worldview, Stanton's cave is almost too good. Anomalous water levels, extinct animals, unexplained ritual objects, a commercial project mysteriously abandoned. A federal agency putting a gate on it. It ticks every box. So I want to do something that these videos usually do not do. I want to actually check. Start with the gate, because the gate is the load-bearing claim. Everything else in the theory is atmosphere. The gate is the thing that supposedly proves intent. And the honest answer is that the gating of Stanton's cave was not a quiet act of suppression. It was the loud, well-documented and frankly overdue reaction to a slow-motion disaster. By the middle of the 20th century, running the Colorado River had stopped being an expedition and started being an industry. Commercial rafting exploded. Thousands of people a year began floating through Marble Canyon, and Stanton's cave, sitting right there above the water with a climbable route to the entrance, became a stop. People went in. People took things. They took figurines. They picked up bones. They pulled driftwood out for campfires. They scratched their names into the walls. And every person who walked across that soft, undisturbed floor churned the stratigraphy, which is the layered sequence of deposits that is the entire scientific value of a site like that. Once you have walked through it, the record is not just damaged. In a specific and irreversible way, it is gone. You cannot unmix a layer. That is the reason for the gate. Not concealment, attrition. A cave that had preserved itself perfectly for 40,000 years was being disassembled in about 20, one souvenir at a time, and the Park Service did the one thing that reliably stops it. And here is the detail that quietly demolishes the whole suppression reading. The gate is not solid, it is a grate. It has bars, and the bars have gaps, and the gaps are there specifically so that bats can continue to fly in and out and roost, because the cave is bat habitat, and sealing it entirely would have killed a colony. That is not what a cover-up looks like. That is what a wildlife biologist looks like. The material from Stanton's cave was not disappeared either. It was excavated by academic archaeologists, catalogued, radiocarbon dated, published in peer-reviewed literature, and deposited in museum collections. You can read the papers. The split-twig figurines from the Grand Canyon caves are in museums. They have been photographed, measured, and written about for decades. The Harrington's mountain goat remains are the basis for what we know about that species, which is another way of saying that without the material from these caves, we would not even know the animal existed. Nothing about that behaves like a secret. But I do not want to leave it there. Because the conspiracy is false, go home, is a lazy ending, and it also misses the far more interesting thing that is actually happening. The Tartaria narrative is wrong about the mechanism. It is not wrong about the instinct. Because there genuinely is a history of the Grand Canyon that gets left out. It is not about a lost global empire. It is about money, land, and who gets to decide what a place is for. And it is a much better story than the one the theory replaced it with. Go back to Stanton and his railroad. That survey was not an eccentric fantasy. It was one entry in a decades-long argument about what the Colorado River corridor was economically. Was it a transport route? Was it a mining district? Was it a water supply? Was it a power source? Was it a tourist attraction? Every one of those answers had serious money behind it, and they were mutually exclusive. By the time Stanton was pulling bodies out of the river, tourism was already winning, and it was winning because of the railroads, not the one through the canyon, the ones that came to the rim. The Santa Fe Railway reached the South Rim in 1901, and the arrival of a rail line changed the entire economic proposition of the place overnight. You no longer had to be an adventurer to see the Grand Canyon. You had to be able to buy a ticket. And once you can sell tickets, the canyon has a business model. It has a hotel, it has a lodge, and a photographer selling prints. It has a company with a very direct financial interest in the canyon staying scenic, staying wild, and above all staying unindustrialized. Now consider what that means for the mining claims. Because there were mining claims all over the canyon, staked by prospectors who found copper and asbestos and did the math, and a great many of those claims quietly stopped being about ore, because it turned out that the most profitable thing you could do with a mining claim in the Grand Canyon was not to mine it. It was to sit on it and charge tourists to walk across it. That is the actual fight, not a mudflood. A land use war, fought with lawyers, between men who wanted to dig the canyon up, men who wanted to run trains through it, men who wanted to dam it, and men who had figured out that the canyon was worth more as a view than as a resource. The federal government stepped in. Theodore Roosevelt declared it a national monument in 1908, using the Antiquities Act, a law written to stop looting of archaeological sites, and used here to lock down an enormous piece of the American West against private development. It became a national park in 1919. The mining claims were fought over in court for years, and the effect, at the level of raw economics, was a transfer. Control of the canyon moved from private extractive interests to federal management, and the canyon was legally redefined from a thing you take things out of into a thing you look at. That is a real and consequential rewriting of what a landscape means. It happened in public. It happened in courtrooms and in the congressional record, and you can read every word of it. And then, in the 1960s, they nearly drowned it. The Bureau of Reclamation, having succeeded spectacularly with Hoover and then with Glen Canyon Dam just upstream, proposed 2 more dams inside the Grand Canyon itself, one at Bridge Canyon, downstream, and one in Marble Canyon. Look at where Marble Canyon Dam was to be built, and then look at where Stanton's cave sits, and you will notice something. The cave is upstream of the dam site, which means it is inside the reservoir, which means that if that dam had been built, the water would have risen slowly and permanently up the Redwall limestone, and it would have come through the mouth of that cave, and 40,000 years of dry, perfectly preserved sediment would have turned to mud in a matter of weeks. The figurines, the condor eggshell, the goat bones, the driftwood that proved the river once ran high. All of it gone in the most bitterly ironic way imaginable, because the river would have finally come back up to reclaim the cave, only this time on a payment schedule set by an electricity contract. The dams were defeated. They were defeated by a public campaign, most famously by the Sierra Club, which took out full-page newspaper advertisements asking whether we should flood the Sistine Chapel so tourists could get nearer the ceiling. Congress backed off. The dams were never built. And an accident of politics, a lobbying fight that had nothing whatsoever to do with archaeology, is the only reason that cave still exists. So think about what that gate actually represents in that context. The same federal government that was, within living memory, seriously planning to submerge Stanton's cave under a reservoir is the government that later welded bars across its mouth to protect it. Those two things are not a contradiction. They are the same thing. They are both assertions of control. What changed was not the ownership. What changed was the price. So why does anybody need Tartaria? I think the answer is uncomfortable, and it has almost nothing to do with the Grand Canyon. The reset narrative is, underneath everything, an economic grievance wearing a costume. Strip out the mud and the lost empire, and what is left is a simple and very modern feeling. Somebody built something extraordinary. Somebody else ended up owning it. And by the time you and I showed up, the story had already been written in a way that made the ownership seem natural and inevitable and permanent, and nobody asked us. That feeling is not stupid. That feeling is, in a lot of contexts, correct. It is what people mean when they look at a 100-year-old public building with hand-carved stone and marble floors and compare it to the beige box that replaced it and think, we can't do that anymore, and someone, somewhere, decided we wouldn't. The Tartaria hypothesis takes that entirely legitimate suspicion that wealth and capability have been concentrated and the history has been tidied up afterward, and it swaps the real, tedious, documented answer for a magical one. Because the real answer is worse. There was no cataclysm. Nobody needed one. The transfer happened out loud, in daylight, through zoning boards and rail charters and land grants and legislation, and it worked precisely because it was boring enough that nobody stayed awake through it. A steel grate on a cave in Marble Canyon is a very small piece of that, but it points at the same thing. It is an assertion, made in metal, that this hole in the rock and everything inside it is now a public asset under federal stewardship, and that the terms of access are no longer yours to set. That is a real exercise of power. You do not need a lost empire to find it worth thinking about. Which leaves us back at the cave, and at the objects, and at the thing that I keep circling and cannot get past. 4,000 years ago, somebody made a deer out of a willow twig. They did it with a technique that requires patience and skill and a knowledge of the material that you only get from long practice. They made a lot of them. And then they carried them, one at a time, up a limestone wall 140 feet above a river that could kill you, into a cave with no light, and they walked back into the dark, and they set them down, and in some cases they built a small pile of stones over them, and then they left, and did not come back, and left us nothing else. No village, no pottery, no names. We do not know what they were asking for. We do not know who they were asking. We have projected the word hunting magic onto it, because it is the least embarrassing thing an academic can say in the absence of any evidence at all, and if we are honest with ourselves, it is a placeholder. What we do know is that the act was expensive. It cost time, it cost risk, and it cost a climb. Nobody does that casually. Whatever was happening in that cave mattered enormously to the people doing it, and the entire content of what it meant is gone, permanently, and no gate, and no excavation, and no radiocarbon date is ever going to get it back. That is the actual mystery of Stanton's cave, not that something is being hidden from you. That something has already been lost, and it was lost long before anybody thought to write it down, and the loss is total. The gate does not keep you out of a secret. The gate is an admission that we got there too late, and that the little we still have is fragile enough that we cannot be trusted around it. Robert Brewster Stanton died in 1922. He never built his railroad. He spent his later years writing about the river, obsessively. A man who had been to the bottom of the world and could not stop describing it. His engineering survey survives. His name is on a cave he did not understand, filled with objects he never saw, from a people he had no framework to imagine. The railroad that would have run past that cave mouth was never laid. The coal never moved. The trains never came. The dam never rose. And 130 years later, after all of it, after the surveys and the drownings and the compacts and the lawsuits and the advertisements and the hearings, the loudest sound in Marble Canyon is still the water, and the only thing that anyone has ever actually managed to build in front of that cave is a locked door. Everything else that was ever attempted in that canyon was an attempt to take something out of it. The gate is the first thing we built there, whose entire purpose was to stop ourselves. Make of that what you will.